The Viltrumites are one of the most terrifying forces in fiction. A civilization that conquered galaxies, wiped out entire species, and built an empire on the bones of billions. So when Thaedus, a Viltrumite himself, engineered a virus that killed the vast majority of his own kind, most people cheered. Finally, someone fighting fire with fire. Finally, justice. But here's the question that lingers long after the credits roll. Does killing billions of people to save billions more actually make you one of the good guys? And more uncomfortably, if you're willing to do it twice, does the justification still hold? Today, we're pulling Thaedus apart. Not his strength, not his backstory, his morality. Because I'd argue his arc is one of the most philosophically loaded in the entire show, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Let's start at the beginning. Thaedus didn't wake up one day and decide to betray his species out of nowhere. He spent centuries watching the Viltrumite Empire do what it does best. Arrive, dominate, and leave entire civilizations as footnotes in history. Billions dead across countless worlds. Not as collateral damage, but as a deliberate feature of Viltrumite expansion. So Thaedus built the Scourge Virus, a biological weapon engineered specifically to target Viltrumite biology. And it worked. It tore through their population and brought an invincible empire to its knees. The Viltrumite numbers collapsed from millions to fewer than 1,000. On the surface, this looks straightforwardly heroic. The math seems clean. Eliminate the species responsible for mass genocide, and you prevent further mass genocide. Simple. But this is exactly where philosophy earns its place in the conversation, because this is pure utilitarian thinking, and utilitarianism is seductive precisely because it makes atrocities feel reasonable. The utilitarian calculus says an action is moral if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. By that metric, the Scourge Virus passes. The Viltrumites were killing billions, Thaedus killed far fewer to stop far more deaths. Net positive, case closed. Except utilitarianism has always had a dark side. It's the framework that, taken to its logical conclusion, can justify almost anything if the numbers work out. And the critical question it sidesteps is this: who gave Thaddeus the authority to make that calculation for billions of beings who never got a vote? The Viltrumites he killed with the virus weren't all standing over fresh graves at the moment of their deaths. Some were soldiers, yes, some were architects of the empire, but the virus didn't discriminate. It targeted biology, not culpability. Thaddeus essentially decided that every Viltrumite alive was guilty enough to die. That's not justice, that's a sentence handed down by a jury of one. Now, and this matters, I'm not arguing that Viltrumites were innocent. They weren't. Not by any means. Their empire was built on documented atrocity, and there's no sanitizing that. The point is that Thaedus' moral framework required him to become something monstrous to fight something monstrous. Whether that trade-off was worth it is genuinely debatable, and the show is wise enough to not give you an easy answer. Most viewers land on, yes, the virus was justified. The Viltrumites earned it. The scale of what they've done to the galaxy made Thaedus' actions feel like a reckoning rather than a crime. That's a legitimate position, but it's worth sitting with the discomfort of how you arrive there, because it requires you to accept that some lives are worth less than others based on species membership. That's a precedent with consequences. Here's where the moral ground on Thaedus starts shifting in a way that's impossible to ignore. Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, a Viltrumite who spent centuries embedded in their culture, rose to genuine prominence within the Empire, and was arguably one of the most devoted soldiers their civilization ever produced. If any Viltrumite was a lost cause, it was him. And yet, Nolan changed. Not quickly, not cleanly. It was messy and painful, and it came at an enormous cost. But Earth changed him. A human family changed him. The experience of living among people who valued connection over conquest cracked something open in him that centuries of Viltrumite conditioning had buried. By the time we reach where we are in the show, Nolan is fighting against the empire he once embodied. This is the single most important data point in the entire Thaedus debate, and it's one Thaddeus himself seems determined to ignore. If Nolan, the poster child of Viltrumite indoctrination, was reachable, then the argument that Viltrumites are inherently irredeemable doesn't hold up. You can't use "they're beyond saving" as a justification for elimination, when the show has already proved that argument wrong through its most extreme possible test case. Thaddeus doesn't have a counter to Nolan. He just chooses not to engage with what Nolan represents. Which brings us to the moment where I think Thaddeus goes from morally complex to morally compromised. By the end of the war, the Viltrumite population has been shattered. We're talking fewer than 40 individuals. 40. The empire that once terrorized entire galaxies has been reduced to a number you could fit in a single building. And crucially, The surviving Viltrumites are now on Earth, the same environment that fundamentally transformed Nolan. So what does Thaedus propose from beyond the grave? Reintroduce the Scourge Virus. Finish the job. Let's apply the same utilitarian framework used the first time and see if it holds. Previously, kill a species in the billions to prevent the death of billions across the galaxy. The numbers justified the act, even if the method was brutal. Now, kill fewer than 40 individuals who are already living on a planet that has demonstrated the capacity to change them, with a virus that could potentially spread to biologically similar species, including humans. The threat calculation is completely inverted. The remaining Viltrumites are not an existential force anymore. They're a remnant, a manageable situation, and the collateral risk is no longer abstract. It includes the people Thaedus is supposedly protecting. The utilitarian argument doesn't just weaken here, it collapses. What Thaedus is describing at the end of the war isn't strategy, it's extermination for its own sake, dressed up in the language of pragmatism. The numbers no longer back him, the logic no longer holds. What remains is something that looks a lot more like hatred than principle. And here's the uncomfortable truth that the show seems to be building toward. In proposing this, Thaedus is thinking exactly like a Viltrumite. Identify a threat, eliminate it completely, accept no alternative. Show no flexibility. The Viltrumite Empire didn't wipe out civilizations because they enjoyed it, at least not officially. They did it because their ideology told them it was necessary, rational, and for the greater good. Thaedus has arrived at the same destination through the opposite door. He spent centuries fighting the Viltrumite worldview, and somewhere along the way it became his own. This is why Mark Grayson matters to this conversation. Mark is half Viltrumite. He has the biology, the strength, the capacity for the kind of thinking we've been discussing. He grew up with Nolan as his father, which means he had a front row seat to exactly how far Viltrumite conditioning runs. And yet Mark consistently, sometimes frustratingly, refuses to write anyone off. That's not naivety. It's a conscious moral position. Mark believes in the possibility of change because he's seen it in the most personal way imaginable. His father is the evidence. Earth is the evidence. And so when Thaedus argues for elimination, Mark represents the clearest possible counterpoint that the measure of your morality isn't what you do when the enemy is overwhelming and the stakes are infinite. It's what you do when the war is essentially won and you still have a choice. Thaedus has Viltrumite blood and Viltrumite instincts, and in season 4, those instincts are winning. Mark has Viltrumite blood too, but he's also the product of everything Earth represents. Compassion as a framework, change as genuine possibility, justice rather than eradication. The gap between them isn't just characterization, it's the thesis of the entire debate. So, is Thaedus morally right? For the Scourge Virus, you can make a real case. It's uncomfortable and philosophically costly, but the argument exists, and it's not trivial. The numbers held, the threat was real. Whether you accept the utilitarian justification or not, you can at least understand it. For season 4, no. The logic has expired. The threat has changed. The same framework that made the first act defensible made the second act indefensible. And what fills the gap isn't strategy or principle, but something that looks far more like the empire Thaedus spent his life opposing. He isn't a villain, but he might be exactly what he always feared he was. A Viltrumite who found a better reason. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, make sure you're subscribed to Twisted Television. There's a lot more where this came from.